Rain crept down the tall windows of Ashcombe Manor in thin, silver threads, blurring the pale light of the December morning and softening the edges of the world beyond the glass. Lady Eleanor Ashcombe stood behind the window pane, as if it were a barrier fashioned for her alone, her fingertips grazing the cold surface while her breath made a fragile fog upon it. She had grown accustomed to watching life from behind walls. Stone walls, social walls, walls built of her father's relentless fear that any misstep of hers might resurrect the scandal he had spent 2 years suppressing. Even now, as the house stirred to its usual rhythm of clattering hearths and distant footsteps, she felt the familiar weight settle on her chest. This was not a home, but a dwelling shaped into a cage. Her father's voice echoed faintly from the hall below, sharp and commanding even when she could not discern the words. Sir Reginald Ashcombe was a baronet of old lineage, but time and bitterness had carved away whatever gentility he once possessed. Since the abrupt end of Eleanor's courtship the previous winter, a humiliation that had left London whispering and her father seething, he had kept her hidden under the polite guise of illness. Invitations had been declined without her knowledge. Letters addressed to her had vanished mysteriously. Even the maids spoke to her more softly now, as if fearing their kindness might be misconstrued as disobedience. Eleanor had not danced, laughed, or sat in a drawing room full of guests in over a year, and the quiet suffocation had woven itself into her every breath. This morning felt no different, until she stepped away from the window and caught the hushed voices of the younger maids drifting up the corridor. She paused, invisible behind the door. "They say she's become something of a legend," one whispered. "The hidden Ashcombe girl. Imagine never leaving the house at all." A soft gasp followed, another voice replying, "It's sad, is it not? Like a storybook princess locked in a tower." The comparison was whispered with pity, not malice, but the words pierced Eleanor's composure all the same. She retreated a single step, pressing a hand to her stomach, longing for the kind of life where she did not exist only as rumor. The sound of carriage wheels crunching wet gravel startled her. Few arrived unannounced. Her pulse fluttered, and she descended the staircase with measured grace, the way she had been trained since girlhood. Through the tall front window, she saw a familiar figure stepping down from a glossy black carriage. Lady Agatha Fernsby, her father's elder sister, and one of the few relatives who regarded Eleanor not as a fragile embarrassment, but as a young woman unjustly denied the world. Agatha's face, half veiled by a feather bonnet, was stern in expression, yet strangely hopeful. The front door opened before Eleanor reached it. Agatha swept inside with the authority of a general, her cloak still damp from the rain. "Eleanor," she declared, her voice a clear stroke of warmth against the cold hall, "you look pale. Have they at least allowed you into the gardens this week?" Eleanor offered a faint smile. "Only once, Aunt. Father has been cautious." Agatha's eyes flashed with quiet indignation. "Cautiousness is a virtue in politics, not in raising daughters. You are 19, not a relic to be covered and stored." Before Eleanor could respond, her father emerged from his study, irritation tightening the lines of his face. "Agatha," he exclaimed, "I was not expecting you." She removed her gloves slowly, intentionally, as though shedding a challenge before his feet. "I am aware. That is precisely why I came." Eleanor sensed the tension between them, a familiar battlefield of wills. She braced herself for another dispute fought over her, as though she were an object of negotiation. Agatha turned to her niece with soft eyes, ignoring Sir Reginald entirely. "My dear, have you heard? Carlton House will host a grand charitable ball in a fortnight, sanctioned by the Prince Regent himself. Every notable family has been invited." Eleanor's breath caught. She had not heard, of course. News rarely reached her unless her father deemed it beneficial. Reginald scoffed. "She will not attend." Agatha raised an eyebrow with quiet precision. "On the contrary, she must. The ton remembers her only as the girl abandoned by a duke. If she does not reappear, your silence will fuel 100 worse assumptions." Eleanor's cheeks warmed at the mention of the man whose departure had carved a hollow in her heart. The Duke of Ashbury, Henry Whitcomb. He had spoken tenderly, danced beautifully, and then left her standing in her mother's old garden as if the months between them had been a misunderstanding. Her father's fury had been immediate. In the days that followed, Eleanor had been stripped from society as though shame itself clung to her skin. "I will not expose her to ridicule," Reginald snapped. "She has suffered enough." Agatha's gaze hardened. "Or perhaps she has suffered because you believe her too fragile to withstand the world. She is stronger than you give her credit for." Then she turned directly to Eleanor. "Child, look at me. Do you wish to attend?" Eleanor hesitated, caught between fear and yearning. The thought of stepping into a ballroom again, of being seen, terrified her. Yet the idea of remaining in this house, invisible, trapped, forever defined by the choices of a man who had abandoned her, that fear was worse. "Yes," she whispered. "I do." Agatha nodded once, as if sealing a pact. "Then it is settled. She will stay with me in London for the next fortnight." Reginald sputtered in outrage, but Agatha's determination was unmoved. "You may either support your daughter or become the reason she remains the subject of gossip. Choose wisely." Within the hour, Eleanor was in her chambers while maids packed her gowns, some too modest, others outdated, and Agatha supervised with brisk efficiency. The air seemed suddenly lighter, as if new possibility seeped through the old walls. Eleanor watched the flurry of activity and felt herself awakening from a long and sorrowful sleep. When Agatha suggested they bring the old seamstress out of retirement to fashion a gown worthy of the Carlton House ball, Eleanor's heart fluttered with a timid spark of excitement. That evening, as the household receded behind them, Eleanor looked back at the manor, its stone facade stern and silent. For the first time since girlhood, she did not feel guilty for wanting to step beyond it. London greeted them with candlelit windows and the rolling murmur of carriages passing through fog. At Agatha's townhouse, Eleanor was led to a guest chamber filled with warm lamplight and the faint scent of lavender. She touched the quilted coverlet as if it were some forbidden luxury. Here, she felt less like a secret and more like a person. Over the next days, she was measured for gowns, instructed in the latest dances, and gently encouraged to reclaim the confidence she had lost. Yet whenever she closed her eyes, she saw the faces that had once judged her, the whispering ladies, the curious gentlemen, the ones who had cast pitying glances when the Duke of Ashbury drifted away from her side. Agatha noticed her unease. "You are not returning to grovel before society," she said firmly. "You are returning to reclaim your rightful place within it. Do not forget that." When the night of the Carlton House ball arrived, London glittered under winter starlight, and the palace seemed to glow from within, every window flickering with gold. Eleanor stood before her reflection as the maid fastened the final pearl clasp on her gown, a soft, pale blue silk that shimmered like moonlit water. She barely recognized herself. Her hair was swept elegantly back, her eyes luminous with a mixture of dread and hope. As Agatha took Eleanor's arm and guided her toward the carriage, the older woman spoke in a low voice meant only for her. "This night will change something for you. I cannot say what, but I feel it." The carriage rolled into the procession of nobles, wheels crunching gently across wet cobblestones. Eleanor watched the glowing figure of Carlton House drawn nearer, its pillars draped with garlands and lanterns. When she stepped through its grand doors, a breath escaped her in a soft, astonished sigh. Music drifted through the vast entrance hall, mingling with the fragrance of pine and candle wax, and the glimmer of jewels under chandeliers cast the scene in soft radiance. As Eleanor entered the ballroom on her aunt's arm, conversations quieted. Faces turned. She forced her chin upward despite the tremor in her pulse. Whispers stirred, but she continued forward, steady as a ship breaking through uncertain waters. She did not flinch. She did not falter. And although she could not yet know it, among the many eyes that followed her was a pair that had noticed not her past, not her shame, but her quiet resilience. For the first time in a year, Eleanor felt the tremble of possibility, like the first break of sunlight through a clouded sky, offering her a path beyond everything she had been forced to endure. Music unfurled through the ballroom like silk in motion, rising from the orchestra in warm, confident waves that wrapped around every guest. Eleanor stood at the threshold for a long moment, adjusting to the swirl of color and conversation. Her heart pounded, not with the panic she had expected, but with an acute awareness of being seen. She felt the weight of curious glances, yet refused to shrink from them. Agatha squeezed her hand once before drifting into conversation with an old friend, leaving Eleanor to navigate the gleaming chamber on her own trembling feet. A young gentleman approached with a courteous bow. His sandy hair, tidy spectacles, an earnest smile made him appear more scholar than socialite. "Lady Eleanor, is it not? I am Mr. Thomas Haraway." His voice held neither pity nor mockery, merely polite curiosity. Eleanor inclined her head with gratitude. He continued, "Would you honor me with the opening dance?" His manner was steady, respectful, and devoid of the calculating scrutiny she feared from most gentlemen. Perhaps that was why she accepted. As he guided her into the forming circle of dancers, Eleanor sensed the air tighten with renewed whispers. Haraway appeared unaffected. "You should not mind them," he said softly, as if reading her thoughts. "Society tires of its old stories. It searches constantly for new ones." She offered a faint smile, though uncertainty pressed at her ribs. The dance began, and the patterned movements steadied her nerves. Haraway proved an attentive partner, offering quiet, well-timed encouragement. Yet even as she moved gracefully under the chandelier's glittering light, she felt eyes on her from across the room, eyes that carried neither judgment nor idle curiosity. She did not dare look until the dance ended. When she finally lifted her gaze past Haraway's shoulder, she saw him standing near the edge of the crowd, a solitary figure amid the sea of silk and uniform. The Duke of Ravensley. His dark hair brushed the high collar of his black coat, and faint shadows under his eyes suggested sleepless nights or burdens carried too long. His presence drew attention without his seeking it. His stillness alone commanded a kind of reverence. He did not smile. He did not look away from her. Eleanor's breath cinched in her throat. She had never seen him before, yet something in his gaze unsettled her with its quiet intensity. Haraway followed the direction of her stare, his expression tightening a fraction. "That is the Duke of Ravensley," he murmured. "Recently returned from the peninsula. A complicated man." Eleanor could not interpret the tone. Was it caution? Disapproval? Jealousy? Whatever it was, she felt a strange pull toward the solitary Duke, who watched her, as though he understood something no one else could. The moment fractured when the clasp of her mother's old bracelet gave way without warning. The thin chain snapped, scattering pearls across the polished floor. Eleanor gasped and knelt instinctively, but before she could gather even one fallen bead, a gloved hand appeared beside hers. She lifted her head and found the Duke kneeling opposite her, his dark coat sweeping the floor like a shadow. "Allow me," he said quietly, his voice warm yet steady as a winter hearth. He collected the pearls with a deliberate gentleness, as if they were fragile memories. Some things deserve to be caught before they fall beyond repair. The statement was simple, but something in his tone stirred a deep ache inside her. He rose and extended the recovered bracelet. Haraway stood stiffly beside her, clearly troubled by the Duke's boldness. Eleanor accepted the bracelet with a trembling whisper of thanks. Ravensley bowed with deep formality, though his eyes remained fixed on hers for a lingering beat. Then he withdrew into the crowd, leaving the faint scent of bergamot and rain in his wake. Whispered speculation spread instantly. Eleanor felt a flush creeping up her neck, unsure whether the moment had been an act of courtesy or something that defied explanation. Haraway offered to retrieve refreshments, leaving Eleanor momentarily alone near a marble column. She steadied herself with careful breaths, but her composure was abruptly shattered by the unmistakable, thundering voice she feared most. Sir Reginald Ashcombe strode through the ballroom doors, his face rigid with fury. "Eleanor!" His voice cracked through the room like a struck bell. Conversations halted. Fans froze midair. The orchestra faltered. Eleanor's stomach plunged. She knew what was coming. Her father reached her in 3 long strides and seized her wrist with bruising force. "You disobeyed me," he hissed. "Dragged our name into further disgrace. Look at them." His glare swept across the watching crowd. Humiliation surged hot in her throat. She tried to pull her arm free, but his grip tightened. A soft tread cut through the suffocating tension. Then a low, unwavering voice. "Release her." The words did not rise in anger. They were spoken with such controlled strength that every nearby guest heard them perfectly. The Duke of Ravensley stood behind her father, his expression solemn yet undeniably resolute. He did not touch Sir Reginald, did not raise his voice, but something in his stillness commanded obedience more effectively than force ever could. "Her arm is not yours to command," he said. A collective gasp stirred through the room. Sir Reginald turned sharply, outrage sparking in his eyes. "This is my daughter," he spat. "I alone am responsible for her conduct." Ravensley met the man's fury without flinching. "Then allow your responsibility to show dignity, not dominance." Eleanor felt her father's grip loosen under the weight of Ravensley's words. She pulled her hand free, retreating half a step toward safety. Sir Reginald glowered at the Duke. "You overstep, sir." "And you overreach," Ravensley replied, his tone unyielding. "If your daughter is seen as a source of shame, then I will shoulder every ounce of that shame myself. I claim the right to court her." The ballroom erupted with whispers, astonishment, envy, intrigue. Eleanor's knees weakened. She had not spoken a word, yet everything around her had changed in the space of a heartbeat. Her father sputtered with disbelief, but the Duke did not wait for his approval. Instead, he removed his black gloves and placed them gently into Eleanor's hands. A soldier's gesture, symbolic of protection and intent. Haraway returned just in time to witness the exchange. His expression darkened with disappointment and something closer to calculation. He tipped his head in a stiff nod, but Eleanor sensed a wound beneath his polite composure. She did not know what to say to him and could only cling to the gloves, their leather cool and unfamiliar against her palm. Aunt Agatha appeared at Eleanor's side, guiding her away from the spreading commotion. "Come, child," she whispered. "You need air." Eleanor allowed herself to be led into the lantern garden beyond the balcony doors. The night air was crisp, scented with pine and distant chimney smoke. Lanterns glowed along the pathways, casting warm circles of light onto frost-kissed hedges. Eleanor leaned against a stone balustrade, struggling to steady her breath. "I did not expect any of this," she whispered. Agatha placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Few moments worth remembering ever come from what we expect." Footsteps approached softly. Eleanor turned to see the Duke entering the garden. Agatha stepped aside with a knowing look, fading into the shadows to grant them a semblance of privacy. Ravensley halted a respectful distance away. "I apologize if I startled you," he murmured, "but I could not stand idle." His eyes searched hers, not possessively, but with a kind of earnest concern she had not felt from a man in years. He nodded toward the gloves she still held. "These are but tokens, nothing binding. If they trouble you, you may return them." Eleanor shook her head slowly. "No, they do not trouble me." A faint, rare softness touched his stern features. "Then I am relieved." The two stood in silence, the lantern light flickering gently between them. There was something about him that made her feel both steadied and unsettled at once. A warmth beneath his solemn exterior, a vulnerability hidden behind his reputation. Yet before she could gather her courage to speak further, faint voices drifted from the open doors, 2 gentlemen passing through the corridor. "The Duke of Ravensley courting a lady? Impossible," one sneered. "He is too marred by war. They say he prefers solitude to company. Any girl tied to him would be pitted." Eleanor's heart began to hammer. The Duke's jaw tightened, though he did not turn. She felt the tremor of old fears rising. Fear of judgment, of repeating the past, of trusting someone only to be humiliated again. She withdrew a step, her voice barely audible. "I should return inside." Ravensley inclined his head with quiet acceptance, though something in his eyes dimmed. As you wish. Eleanor turned away, slipping back toward the hall, but her steps faltered at the threshold. She pressed a hand against her chest, fighting tears she refused to shed here where anyone might see. The weight of uncertainty pressed upon her again, heavier than before. Behind her, the Duke remained in the lantern-lit garden, his expression unreadable, watching the door she had disappeared through as though he had lost something he had only just begun to find. Eleanor woke before dawn, her heart thudding as if it had spent the night trying to outrun her thoughts. The events of the previous evening, her conversation with the Duke, the fragile spark of hope he had dared to kindle, the subtle shift she had felt in the air around him, swirled through her mind with unsettling insistence. She rose quietly, careful not to disturb her aunt, and moved to the small window of their guest chamber. London stretched outward in shades of pearl and lavender, its rooftops washed in the faintest hint of morning light. Below, the city was stirring. A cart creaked down the lane, a milk boy whistled cheerfully, and a pair of watchmen argued about something trivial. These were ordinary sounds, yet Eleanor felt as though she were hearing the world anew. With her palms pressed to the cool glass, she whispered to herself that she must not misread a kindness as a promise. Men like the Duke of Ravensley did not simply decide to intervene in the affairs of young women whose families wished to keep them invisible. And yet her memory replayed the way he had watched her, not with idle curiosity or the shallow interest she had seen in many suitors' eyes long ago, but with something sharper, more attentive. His gaze had carried the weight of a man accustomed to observing danger, measuring intention, and choosing his moment. It unsettled her now, not because she feared him, but because she feared what hope might do to a woman who had long been taught never to expect rescue. When her aunt finally stirred, Eleanor forced her face into an expression of composed neutrality. But Lady Wickham was not easily fooled. She poured tea, appraised Eleanor as though the girl were a patient attempting to hide a fever, and declared, "You slept poorly, either from excitement or from apprehension. Knowing you, likely both." Eleanor attempted to smile, though it felt thin and unconvincing. "Aunt, I assure you, I am perfectly well." "Perfectly well," her aunt repeated with a skeptical lift of her brow. "Yet you stare at the door every time a footstep echoes in the corridor." "My dear, if you wish to speak of the Duke—" "I do not," Eleanor interrupted, though her pulse betrayed her. "It would be unwise to give too much thought to possibilities." Lady Wickham placed her teacup down gently, as though she were handling something fragile. "My child, you've been denied possibilities your entire life. If one has found you, do not turn away out of habit." Eleanor had no answer for that. She only bowed her head, grateful and frightened in equal measure. Later that morning, the Duke's note arrived, carried not by a footman in livery, but by a discreet messenger whose clothing bore no identifying marks. Eleanor's aunt opened it first, as propriety demanded, though she pretended she was only inspecting the seal. She read the contents with widening eyes before handing the page to Eleanor. "I write in hopes that Lady Eleanor might allow me the honor of calling upon her this morning. I have business nearby and would regret letting the day pass without expressing my gratitude for her company last night. If this request is inconvenient, I shall of course withdraw." There was nothing improper in the wording, nothing that could compromise Eleanor's reputation. Yet her aunt gave her a look that said this small invitation was a stone that might begin the collapse of far larger walls. Eleanor read the note twice before finally whispering, "Yes, I would see him." When the Duke arrived an hour later, he did so with a calm, almost military precision. He bowed to Lady Wickham first, thanked her for receiving him, then turned to Eleanor with a softness she had not expected. He held no flowers, carried no trinkets, and made no attempt to flatter her with excessive praise. Instead, he asked after her comfort, whether she had rested, and whether the noise of the city had disturbed her. His manner held a quiet formality, but beneath it pulsed a sincerity that made her breath stutter. They spoke in the parlor, under her aunt's watchful but not intrusive gaze. The conversation began with polite topics: artillery innovations he had witnessed during the war, a book Eleanor had been reading, and the Prince Regent's increasingly elaborate whims. Slowly, however, the Duke steered their dialogue toward more personal territory. "Lady Eleanor," he said at last, his voice low enough that it felt like a confidence shared. "Last night you spoke of longing for a life beyond the walls your father has built around you. Forgive me if I presume, but I sense the matter is more severe than you have admitted." Her fingers tightened around the edge of her seat. It was not common for a nobleman to ask directly about private grievances, not without expecting gossip in return. Yet the Duke sounded not intrigued by scandal, but concerned about justice. "It is not a matter I can discuss freely," she said, choosing each word carefully. "My father is determined to protect what remains of our family standing." "By hiding you?" the Duke asked gently. She hesitated. Her aunt watched her closely, but did not interfere. Eleanor drew a steadying breath and replied, "By restricting my movements, limiting my acquaintance, and ensuring I am not placed in situations he cannot control." The Duke's expression did not shift dramatically, yet something in his eyes darkened, like a storm gathering behind still waters. He leaned back slightly, as though giving her space, though his focus did not waver. "You deserve more than that," he said quietly. "No woman should have her life governed entirely by another's fears, least of all when her own character has given no cause for such treatment." Eleanor felt a tightening in her throat. "My father does what he believes necessary." "And you?" he asked. "What do you believe necessary?" She had no ready answer. For so long, she had lived within the boundaries set by others that she had nearly forgotten how to imagine a world outside them. The Duke studied her silence with an attentiveness that made her chest ache. When he spoke again, his tone was gentler. "If you wish it, I can offer assistance, not to defy your father, but to ensure you are not left without choices. Choice, Lady Eleanor, is a right too often denied and too rarely reclaimed." She lifted her gaze to his, startled by the weight of his words. "Why would you offer such a thing to me?" He did not look away. "Because I have seen too many lives destroyed by the tyranny of those who believe themselves unassailable. And because I find I would not care to see yours added to that number." Her breath caught. It was not a declaration of affection, nor a pledge, nor a dramatic vow. It touched her more deeply than any grand gesture could have done. Before she could reply, a sharp knock sounded at the door. Her aunt rose, confusion flickering across her face. The housemaid entered with an anxious expression and handed Lady Whitcomb a newly arrived letter. The wax bore the unmistakable seal of Sir Reginald Ashcombe, Eleanor's father. Eleanor felt her stomach twist as her aunt read it. Lady Whitcomb's complexion paled, and her fingers tightened noticeably around the page. "What is it?" Eleanor whispered. Her aunt looked at her, then at the Duke, her voice barely steady. "Reginald knows you attended the ball." Eleanor's breath fled her. "He demands your immediate return," her aunt continued. "He writes that any refusal will be interpreted as willful disobedience and will result in measures he does not specify, but implies are severe." The Duke stood slowly, his posture no longer relaxed but sharpened, alert, almost commanding. The air in the parlor shifted, as though something invisible had drawn itself taut. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel, "you will not return alone. If your father wishes to confront the matter, he may do so while I am present." Eleanor stared at him, torn between dread and a fierce, unexpected surge of courage. For the first time in her life, someone was offering to stand beside her in open defiance of the man who had controlled her world. Her aunt exhaled shakily. "We will have to go at once." Eleanor rose on unsteady legs. She looked at the Duke, at the resolve etched into his expression, and felt something inside her shift, something bold and trembling and utterly new. "Then let us go," she whispered, steadying herself with a breath. "Let us face him." The Duke extended his arm, and this time she did not hesitate before taking it.